MEE can reveal the US and Israel are actively working to strip Jordan of its historic custodianship of Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque complex. The revered Muslim site has been managed for decades by the Jordanian-appointed Islamic Waqf. The new US proposal was championed by President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner and the US ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee. It seeks to replace the Waqf with a new authority appointed by Israel's government. The body would declare the Al-Aqsa Mosque a multi-faith centre and have the power to monitor everything from the appointment of imams to the content of Friday sermons. The White House has denied the plan, which was detailed to MEE by US, Jordanian and Palestinian officials, as well as Western and Gulf Arab sources. And we can hear all about it now from my colleague Sean Matthews, who was part of the team that broke the story. Sean, welcome back to MEE Live. Tell us, why is this story such a significant development?
Well, thank you for having me on. And it very much is a massive development for the region. The Jordanians are extremely concerned about this push, obviously. I think the way that we can discuss this is basically the ramifications, of course, for Jerusalem itself, which is occupied. Al-Aqsa sits in occupied East Jerusalem. Any move to change the status quo there in occupied East Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa would be explosive for, I think, Palestinians, for Jewish Israelis, for Christians who live in the city. It would very much destabilize this very delicate status quo that exists, at least, but is being slowly eroded by the Israeli settler movement in East Jerusalem. So there's the Palestinian story side to this. There's also the Jordanian side to this. As I said, the Jordanians are extremely nervous. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, have been custodians of the Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem since 1924, and that is very much a pillar of their of their claim to rule Jordan, the Hashemite Kingdom, is that custodianship of Jerusalem, the Muslim and Christian holy sites there. So for the Palestinians, for Christians, and I would say for Jewish Israelis, it's very explosive. For the Jordanian monarchy, it's very disturbing, and of course for the wider region. What this would be seen as is really a move to upend the status quo, which is very, very fragile, and obviously it is under intense pressure already from the occupation in the West Bank, from Israel's war in Gaza, from the war on Iran right now. A very, very delicate status quo. So this is just another another match that could really, really light the region in flame if this plan is carried through.
So it could really have a destabilizing effect, which raises the question, what's driving this? Your sources said that Israel first floated this plan with Trump's first administration almost a decade ago. So why now? Who is driving this initiative today?
Yeah, very much so. So, I mean, the history here is that, as far back as 2018, Jared Kushner, during the first Trump administration, was working, many people thought, on a similar plan. At the time, it's very interesting, the monarchy that was going to take over custodianship that was discussed, this fear, it was actually going to be Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So back in 2018, 2019, the U.S. was working actively to try to normalize relations between the Saudis and the Israelis. And kind of one of the consolation prizes that was discussed potentially, and this was the fear, was bestowing custodianship of the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem to the Saudis. Of course, there's a very, very deep history here, which was very alarming at the time. So I think we have to go back to the history of the region. The Hashemites have been custodians of the Muslim and Christian holy sites in East Jerusalem since 1924. Before that, of course, the Hashemites were custodians of Mecca and Medina during the time of the Ottoman Empire. That was a 700-year custodianship. When the Hashemites were driven out of what is today modern Saudi Arabia by the Saud family, obviously the custodianship of Mecca and Medina passed to the Saud family, and then the Hashemites, who established the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, were granted custodianship of the Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. Remember, at the time, Jerusalem was under control of a British mandate power, and then the Hashemite Kingdom had just been established. The Jordanians officially annexed the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem in 1950, following the Nakba and the Arab-Israeli War. Of course, they lost their hold on that territory in 1967 when the Israelis conquered it. And then, interestingly enough, though, right, from 1967 through the occupation up until today, through the 1994 peace agreement, which the Jordanians signed with the Israelis even, that custodianship of the Muslim and Christian holy sites has been preserved for the Hashemite Kingdom. because it's seen kind of as this anchor of stability for the region, right? That is, again, as I said, how the Hashemites kind of lay claim to legitimacy within their own country. And their custodianship of these sites really traces itself back to the British Mandate era. And again, the notion that the Hashemites control both, have this custodianship of both the Christian and the Muslim holy sites is very, very important, because it kind of it prevents, I think, this sectarianism that many people fear that the Israelis might want to provoke in Jerusalem. So again, the joint custodianship of Muslim and Christian holy sites is very, very important for the kind of the status quo in Jerusalem. But this is just, it shows how explosive this is that through almost a century, the Hashemites have been able to keep hold of that custodianship with U.S. support up until very recently. So there was that push in 2018, as I was saying, from the U.S., which could potentially envision Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Israel. And then, of course, the U.S. recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Of course, East Jerusalem is occupied under international law, so that was going to be very explosive. But one of the lubricants, one of the ways that which they could assuage those concerns in the Arab world, they felt at the time, was to give the Saudis, which is obviously the biggest country in the region, the custodianship and take it away from the Hashemites. But that plan fell through. So now it's being resurrected again. And as we look and we ask, why now? I think, Mathilda, the answer is that, the Trump administration has roughly 3 years left in office. Trump does not have a third term coming up, despite the fact that he talks about it a lot. And I think there is a push. What I'm told from my sources is that now is the time, is that many people in the administration who are kind of pushing for this, Jared Kushner and his allies, feel that this could be the moment in which they can achieve this, because obviously, as I said, Trump is out in 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, there is a lot to unpack in that. One of the things is if the original plan floated the idea of handing custodianship from the Hashemites to Saudi Arabia, well, it's obvious this is a huge blow to the Hashemites and to Jordan. But it's also a blow to Saudi Arabia if today that plan involves handing that custodianship over to Israel. How would Saudi Arabia likely respond to this proposal?
Well, our sources told us that the Saudis are dead set against this plan, basically. I was told from a source briefed by the Hashemite kingdom that the U.S. and Israel has consulted with Egypt, Bahrain, the UAE, and Morocco, along with Saudi Arabia on this. So all these countries have been briefed. The Egyptians, my understanding is that they're also opposed to this. It's unclear where the UAE stands. Obviously, they are the closest Arab state to Israel, but the Saudis are dead against this. And Mathilda, I think this really tells us how much the region has transformed and how much we've seen Saudi Arabia's kind of approach to these issues transform. In 2018, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was still new to the job, one would say. He was very close with the UAE. He was more willing at the time, many feel, to engage in these risky gambits, such as the intervention in Yemen's war, and potentially negotiating kind of this normalization agreement with Israel, which would have broken with decades of Saudi consensus, which is not that Saudi won't normalize with Israel, but that the Saudis kind of require this pathway, right, to an independent Palestinian state, a viable Palestinian state. So in 2018, there was a thought within the U.S. that the Saudis could be kind of pulled away from that consensus view, and hence kind of this discussion about a broader, a grand bargain, let's say, in the sphere. I think now, fast forward to 2026, the region has changed tremendously, and Saudi Arabia very much is opposed to this. So it shows kind of, I think, how out of step the U.S. actually might be with the region.
And would you mind talking to us a little bit about the personalities that you mentioned who were driving this? You said Jared Kushner was behind it the first time and this time. Jared Kushner doesn't even have an official role in the administration. The other name you mentioned is Huckabee. What are their business here with Al-Aqsa?
Yeah, obviously. So, Jared Kushner is President Donald Trump's son-in-law. He's an unofficial envoy, but he has massive sway, obviously, within the Trump administration. He has been negotiating an end to the war in Iran. He was instrumental in negotiating a very fragile ceasefire in Gaza. So really an instrumental player here. Obviously, his family has deep ties going back decades with Netanyahu. Mike Huckabee is the U.S. ambassador to Israel. He is obviously a proponent of evangelical Christian faith, very devoted to kind of this identity, this Christian identity of evangelical Christianity, which in many ways kind of, it goes back to looking for the second coming and the notion that basically, we can have a second coming only if all the Jews in the world return to Jerusalem. And of course, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is destroyed and the Second Temple is rebuilt. So there is a strand there. I think this is more, to me, less ideological and more opportunity driven from Kushner's side. As we discussed back in 2018, Huckabee wasn't in his job, but this push was still alive. So I think this is very much coming from Kushner and also the Israelis. Let's not forget, you have ministers, far-right ministers in the Israeli government that openly talk about building a second temple on the site of Al-Aqsa Mosque. So again, I think that the push is real. You do have these personalities driving it. On one hand, Kushner, who's very close to Trump. You have the evangelical Christian kind of strain of thought that is pushing this, and you also have obviously the far right in Israel, which is toying with this idea and pushing it, to be frank. But again, the region has changed tremendously.
But what is in it for Trump? I mean, if this, as you described, could be quite a destabilizing move and could piss off his Gulf neighbors, to use the journalistic term, what is in it for Donald Trump? How would he tell this story as a win, as an American victory?
Well, so the language, I think, is very interesting that the Americans are using, this idea of a multi-faith center. We have one similar comparison to this. The UAE obviously joined the Abraham Accords. It's Israel's closest Arab ally, and the UAE has established a multi-faith center in the country, in the Emirates, which has a Catholic church, a Jewish synagogue, and a mosque. So some of my sources kind of said that this idea of a multi-faith center, which obviously our sources are concerned about very deeply, this being kind of a Trojan horse for the settler movement to step into Al-Aqsa. But this idea of a multi-faith center could kind of feed into the Abraham Accords, I think, which Trump sees as his greatest foreign policy achievement. And of course, Mathilda, the other thing that should be noted is that a lot of the kind of deep expertise within the State Department, in the U.S. intelligence community, which follows this very closely and is very much aware of the explosive nature of these kind of talks, they are sidelined in the Trump administration. I was talking with a former CIA officer who saw the story and messaged me and said, insane, basically, that they would be considering this. So I think within the U.S. establishment, especially Middle East watchers, longtime Middle East watchers, there are those who are deeply opposed to this because they are afraid about the stability of the Hashemite kingdom. They are afraid about sectarian conflict in Jerusalem and the collapse of the status quo. But you have basically this Kushner, you have basically the Kushner kind of strand, and you have the evangelical Christian strand of foreign policy making in the U.S. really pushing Trump into this. And I don't think he's getting the other voices in his ear.
Now, if Jordan's government does have to actually counter this, given that the government is US-backed, is that something that they can realistically do? What pathway do they have to fight this?
The Jordanians are in a very difficult position right now. Of course, obviously, Jordan is a massive recipient of U.S. aid. It's been hit very strongly by the war in Iran, rising energy prices. Jordan, it's energy poor. It has very energy-rich neighbors in the Gulf, but it's energy poor. So the Jordanians are in a tough position. What I am told is that the Jordanians are trying to come up with a proposal which would sidestep kind of this American-Israeli move to deem Al-Aqsa a multi-faith center and somehow preserve the Hashemite custodianship. So again, they're not trying to combat this head on right now, but they're trying to have a workaround which would basically bypass this U.S. plan, in effect make it null and void by continuing the Hashemite custodianship on a separate track. But again, Jordan is under intense pressure from the U.S. And what I was told also is that, the Jordanians still raise, a lot of the times you'll see the foreign ministry, the Jordanian parliament, which is obviously very tightly controlled by the king, will raise at times Israeli aggression in Al-Aqsa. They will raise when there are violations kind of the status quo in the media. And this is something that the U.S. and Israel are not happy with. So Jordan is under a lot of pressure, unfortunately, to keep its mouth shut and not to complain about the erosion of the status quo at Al-Aqsa. So I think some of this plan, my understanding, is also kind of a move to push the Jordans into acquiescing to greater Israeli encroachment. And the Jordanians are going to lean very heavily, again, on the Gulf states. I think also on Egypt. The Jordanians and the Egyptians have a very good relationship. Egypt is opposed to this plan, I am told, as are the Saudis very strongly. So the Jordanians are going to lean on those relationships to try to push back, because by itself, Jordan can't really push back. But if it can kind of get a consensus within the Gulf, I think it will be successful. Turkey as well. The outlier, of course, is the UAE, my sources tell me, because it's not clear where the UAE stands on this.
I was about to ask about that. What about the UAE? What about Bahrain? I mean, the UAE has repeatedly positioned itself as Israel's closest Arab partner. Bahrain has also maintained close ties, particularly in the midst of the Iran war, and justified its engagement with Israel as necessary for countering Iran. What if UAE or Bahrain back the US proposal?
I think I think the real country to watch is the UAE. Obviously, Bahrain is a very small state. It's very much dependent on Saudi Arabia for its security. It has moved closer, Bahrain, to the UAE recently amid the Iran war because of their own concerns about kind of the attacks that Iran has perpetuated on the Gulf states. But the state that everyone I'm talking to is watching is the UAE, and it's an open question. You know, the UAE is isolated right now within the GCC. Obviously, they left OPEC. They're kind of in all these kind of fissures right now with the Saudis and Yemen and Sudan. But if they were to kind of back this fully, I think it would be a serious breach in the Gulf. So again, to me, none of my sources have confirmed that the UAE is directly supporting this, but I think that the UAE might be open to it, or if that's being weighed, that's going to be a problem for the Gulf. I think, as I said, according to what I'm hearing from my sources, that Saudi Arabia is dead opposed to this. Most of Egypt is opposed to this. So if the UAE was to back this, they really would be an outlier, and it would only deepen their isolation in the region.
And now I believe that the White House reacted to the story after MEE published it. What did they say? How was their reaction?
Yeah, I mean, their reaction was fast and furious. We had reached out to the U.S., to the State Department multiple times for comment on this story. In fact, we even said that we would be willing to take a comment after publication if they would update us. It took them more than 24 hours to get back to us. But the White House obviously responded very aggressively on this. But again, we had a multitude of sources across continents, U.S. officials, Gulf officials, Western officials, very, very close to the Hashemite kingdom, sources briefed by the Hashemite kingdom. So I think the U.S. was very concerned that they were outed on this because it is so explosive for the region.
Well, Sean Matthews, as ever, it has been fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for your time and for your reporting here today. Dr. Abdullah Marouf, Palestinian historian and former media officer for the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Dr. Abdullah, welcome to MEE Live. So we've just talked about US plans to strip Jordan's custodianship of Al-Aqsa and hand managerial control to an Israeli-appointed body. How significant is this for Palestinians in Jerusalem?
Actually, this is a very serious issue. It is related directly to a very important, and not only for the Palestinians, but for the whole Muslim world. We're speaking about the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in the world for Muslims. And it is a very serious issue to try to alter the status quo in Al-Aqsa Mosque and change the facts on ground and act as if there is a new de facto on the ground by the Israelis, drawn by the Israelis. It is a very dangerous report. I read it and I was very concerned about it, and I published it on my social media, and I had very interesting reactions, and some of them actually were from some pro-Israel accounts who try to claim that this is a false report and this is not true facts, and this is sensational issue. But it's not actually based on sensational issues. What made me really very concerned about this report by Middle East Eye is that we have facts on the ground that can support what is happening and what is being said in this report. One of them, and one of the most important facts that happened, was that Jared Kushner, back in 2017, actually mentioned this, and he claimed during the time, you remember when the so-called deal of the century was proposed by Donald Trump at that time, by the Donald Trump administration, first administration. Jared Kushner spoke about this issue about Al-Aqsa Mosque, and he said that after the American move of the American embassy to Jerusalem and the admission of the United States of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the issue of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or as he called it, the Temple Mount, has to be solved, and it should be under the Israeli sovereignty. He mentioned that in 2017. Now we are in 2026, and we know that everything that has been happening since that time until this time support that the United States under this administration is actually not supporting Israel, but actually supporting the ultra-right wing in Israel. It's supporting the Zionist Hadatit, or the religious Zionist stream that is controlling now the Israeli politics. This is what makes this very concerning, and makes the Palestinian people and the Muslim world actually feel so concerned about this issue. And we have facts on ground that supports as well the fact that the Israelis are trying now to take many of the administrative policies from powers, actually, from the Islamic Waqf and give it to the Israeli police. And we have seen that in Ramadan, at the beginning of Ramadan, during Ramadan, in the closure, and even after the closure, and after Al-Aqsa Mosque was open. So we know what is happening on the ground. So we know that there is something underground that is being drawn and tried to be applied as a de facto in Al-Aqsa Mosque.
And of course, this is not an isolated incident. Besides the actions that you have just described, there has been growing interference on the site, growing incursions on the site by this group of Israeli society that you described, this ultra-nationalist, religious extremist section of society. Can you just tell us what these incursions look like today, and how do they compare to your history working at Al-Aqsa? Do you think that there's an escalation? Do you think that it's been pretty constant? Can you just tell us today, how does the status today compare to the previous history of Al-Aqsa?
Well, I don't think that the word "do you think" is the right question, actually, because we are seeing new facts on ground. We are not actually thinking about it. It's not, again, a sensational issue. We can see new facts on ground. The Israelis have never been allowed to pray or do any rituals inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque beside the Muslims. This is actually against international law. Why? Because international law emphasizes that the status quo in Al-Aqsa Mosque has to remain as it is, and that means the status quo means that everything that all the situation in Al-Aqsa Mosque before the 7th of June in 1967 has to remain as it is. Now, the problem with the Israeli government is that the Israeli, Benjamin Netanyahu in particular, has his own understanding of the word status quo. He claims that the status quo is every new fact on ground that Israel creates. So whenever a new fact on ground is created, a new de facto is created, he claims that this is the new status quo. That is absolutely wrong. And that's against the international law and international understanding, actually, of the status quo. Now, in 2015, let's say, when the problems erupted in Jerusalem, John Kerry, the Secretary of State of the United States at that time, flew to the region, and he had what was called at that time the Kerry Accords. Now, in these Kerry Accords, Kerry gave the Israeli settlers the right to visit Al-Aqsa Mosque. And by that, I say he gave them the right, because according to the status quo, on the 6th of June, 1967, there was no one whatsoever, whoever was that, had the right to enter Al-Aqsa, pray into Al-Aqsa Mosque, or do whatever inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, except for the Muslims and the Muslim Waqf, and under the Muslim Waqf authority solely. The sole authority, the sole sovereignty was for the Muslim Waqf solely. Now, he claimed that the Muslims have the right to pray inside what he called the Temple Mount. He means the Al-Aqsa compound, of course, and the Jews have the right to visit, not to pray. Now, all of that has been changed in 2024. Now, on that year, just about less than 2 years from now, since now, Itamar Ben-Gvir gave the right to the settlers who break into Al-Aqsa Mosque to perform the rituals clearly, publicly, and loudly inside Al-Aqsa Mosque. So this is why, since that time, we are seeing every day an area in Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the eastern area of Al-Aqsa Mosque, has almost been acted as if it was converted into a semi synagogue, if I could say, or a semi-temple inside Al-Aqsa. And all of these settlers are praying and doing their rituals inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is, again, according to the international law, it is absolutely unacceptable, because this place solely belongs to the Muslims. According to the international law, according to the historical laws, according to the religious laws, according to the UNESCO, according to every single law on this earth, it belongs only to Muslims, because Muslims did not take it from anybody 1400 years ago. That is the thing that the Israelis are trying to alter. Before 2003, there were absolutely no Israeli settler was allowed even to enter Al-Aqsa Mosque until the Israeli police decided.
Okay, no, I understand that transition,
enter.
that timeline you're talking about. There's a couple of things I want to follow up on. One is, okay, you've detailed this timeline of change, and you have mentioned that, Ben Gvir, that there has been since 2022 the most far right-wing government in Israel. So it's pretty clear where that escalation inside Israel is coming from. But what is driving that escalation from the US perspective? Because this couldn't happen, or at least this particular plan we're seeing now, this couldn't happen without a US drive. So what from the US position do you think explains that escalation that you've just detailed?
A very simple answer is the presence of today, of the evangelical wing in the United States, and their control over this area. We've seen, for example, that the Speaker of the House, brought or welcomed a rabbi, Tahimamu, his name is Tahimamu, who's responsible for the so-called the red heifers, the 5 red heifers that were taken from Texas all the way to a settlement north of Ramallah, which is Shiloh settlement, which is an illegal settlement, by the way. And that's quite important to see that this man, the Speaker of the House of the United States, brought this man as a guest of honor at the beginning of 2024, in order to speak about the red heifers and the presence, the new coming of the Messiah. Now, we know that the Minister of War, or Minister of Defense at that time, and Minister of War now, Pete Hegseth, actually is one of the ultra right-wing religious evangelical activists since long time, actually, since he was at the university. And he presents this, and he didn't have any problem in 2017 to speak clearly. And we have the video when he said that there is no reason why the miracle of building the temple cannot happen. It will happen in our time, and I hope that it will happen in our time, but we don't know how, but it will happen. That means that we are speaking here about the highest person in the Israeli army speaking about building a temple inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is, according to the international law, against the law. So we are seeing and witnessing a very crucial and very interesting control by the evangelical wings inside the current administration in the United States that has never happened before in the United States throughout the history of the United States, because the evangelical wing has never been in control in the United States as it is now under the second administration of Donald Trump.
Dr. Abdullah Marouf, thank you for your time.